Hi everyone, my name is Talia from Zart and today we're going to be creating a nature-inspired pinch pot. Here is an example of what we'll be creating today. So this is our natural clay pinch pot and we've got some different things inspired by nature attached to the pot, like seed pods, gum nuts and other things. But for today we're focusing on a simple pinch pot technique and then how to join some smaller items onto that pinch pot, as well as going through the glazing and firing process. So for the start of this project, we need to choose our natural clay to work with. So I'm working with an earthenware clay. So this is a white earthenware clay, so a low fire clay, and we'll be constructing this into our pinch pot to begin. So when we're doing our pinch pot, I like to start with a sphere. So for your students, they might need to work their clay to get it into that spherical shape, or you can give them a lump of clay that is already roughly in a sphere. So if you are working with clay that has been around for a while, you will want to knead it. So by kneading it, you can use the heel of your hand and press that down to get any air bubbles out. Now I'm working on a silicone mat just so my clay doesn't stick to the table or whatever surface I'm working on, and it's a little bit cleaner as well, instead of the clay picking up things that might be on the table, because that can cause trouble in the kiln if you've got little pockets of debris and different things from your table that are sticking into your clay. So I am using the heel of my hand. This is also much easier if you can stand up. So if your students are able to stand up and put a bit of pressure, a bit of force into their rolling, then that will be a bit easier for them to do as well. So I've got a rough ball. If you see any areas where you think there might be air pockets, just make sure that you're pressing that down and getting rid of that. I have already kneaded this clay for a little while before starting, so I'm not too worried about air bubbles right now because I have already kneaded it, but your students might need to. So I've got a rough sphere shape. It doesn't have to be a perfect sphere, as long as your clay is nice and compact and you can't see any joining areas which might cause air bubbles. Now we've got our rough sphere. I'm going to pinch in the inside, so using my thumbs and pressing outwards. So your students can do this as many times as they need to. They can repeat this process over and over again if they don't like their pot. So don't be too worried about getting it perfect the first time. So I am pressing my thumbs into the center of my pot and pressing outwards. Now your clay might start to get a little bit dry, especially if it's warm inside. So I like to have either a cloth or just a small amount of water, or even a sponge to moisten my hands. I'm not putting lots and lots of water into my pot, because then I'll just create slip and it'll be muddy and hard to work with. So make sure that you use your water sparingly so that you are not creating a terrible muddy texture of clay. So this is the start of my pinch pot. It's starting to take shape. I don't want my walls to be too thick, because if they're too thick, again, more risk of things going wrong in the kiln later on, which we will talk about a little bit more when we're up to our firing stage. So keep pressing out, make those walls thin. We don't want them too thin, we don't want them too thick either. So what tends to happen here is that your base will start to get really thick, especially if you're concentrating on pushing out those outside walls. So you can press down to make sure that your base is spreading out. Now I don't mind the organic look of this pot. If you have students, and you will have some students that really like to smooth out all those lumps and bumps, you can let them do that depending on what kind of pot they want to create, but I think the organic forms in this pot look really nice, and even the impression of my fingers in the pinch pot, I think it works really well with the idea behind this work being organic forms and natural materials. So I'm going to leave it a little bit rough, but your students might want to smooth it out and create a really nice, symmetrical, smooth pot, but that is their design choice, depending on what they want to do. So my pot is taking a nice shape. So if we think about how thick we want our walls to be, we do want them to be roughly even. I like to think of it as about a pinky finger width in size. That tends to be a good size to go with, and something that your students can measure as they're going. So make sure it is roughly even. So I'm pushing out some of those walls and making sure that my clay isn't getting too dry. So keep pushing, keep pressing out. And like I mentioned before, if you want to start all over again, maybe your pot's too big, it's too small, or the walls are getting really thin, then you can just bunch up your clay, knead it, and create another sphere and go again with that process. But you might have limited time in your class, so be aware of that. But otherwise, I think that's pretty good. Looks roughly even, and I've got those nice finger marks around the edges of the bowl, which I like and I am going to keep. So now we've got our bowl, we've got our pinch pot. That's the first step done, very easy. Depending on what level you are working with, then you might want to do your attachments to the outside now. So we're going to need some more clay. I've wrapped my clay because clay dries very quickly. So every time you're working, put that to the side, every time you're working with clay, if you've got pieces of clay that aren't being used, make sure you wrap them up. Keep them moist, otherwise you will have dry clay and you won't be able to do much with it. Now we're creating our attachments. I've got my dried bowl here. We'll talk about drying time in a minute, but you can see I've got some gum nuts, I've got some pods and things. You can keep your shapes really simple. So if you're doing it with younger year levels and you just want to teach them basic joining techniques, then you can do some really simple seeds like this. If you're working with older year levels, you might want to do more complicated things like these gum nuts here. But we're hand modeling these, so nothing too complicated. I've got a range of wooden clay tools over here as well, which I will be using to help me make my shapes. Again, if your clay is starting to dry out, a little bit of water and just massage that in there without making things overly wet. So pressing with my fingers to make some of these pods, and I've got a skewer. I love working with skewers and my hands. I think they're sometimes all the tools that you need, but exploring with a range of different tools is very beneficial to your students to figure out what kind of shapes and designs they can make. Even if you want to have a lesson of just exploring some of those tools and not necessarily making anything for your finished piece, then that is actually a really valuable lesson for your students to have a bit of a play and figure out things for themselves. So that's a very simple seed pod, and we don't want anything to be too thin. So if I kept thinning this out and getting it very realistic with a very, very thin stem, that's more likely to crack later on. So I don't want to go too thin because I don't want anything to crack, especially if your students are beginning with clay. Then you want to make sure that when their pieces come out of the kiln, it is in one piece. So I'm going to make a few of these and then we'll get on to our next shape. So I've made a few of these shapes. So I think this type of work works really well when you've got a variety of the same shape and they can go in the same area of your pot or in different areas. So you might want to design your pot where everything's sitting, or you can just kind of freeform it and see where things go. Now let's join these to our pot. So we're going to score the area where we are going to attach our pieces. So we score the pot and we score our shape or our form. And here, if you've got slip made up, you can use slip, but what I tend to find is just using a bit of water on both areas tends to be enough if you've scored it up well enough. But if you are someone who likes to use their slip, then definitely brush on some slip to attach, but it's not absolutely necessary. My pots have joined pretty well without the slip, and I tend to like to join things on the base. So using some of your wooden tools, I like to drag some of that clay up and down and join your pieces there. So I'm just getting in. So you can see some of the water has already reacted with the clay and created its own slip without having to necessarily mix up your own slip. So that's how I like to work. If you want to make sure there are no errors and nothing falls off, then you might want to play it safe and mix up your own slip for the students to use. But this has worked for me. Try it, see if it works for you. But I think that is enough to get things joined. So just working on that seam to join it, and this will make sure that nothing will fall off later on. So that's how I'm joining these pieces. I'm going to join the rest of those pieces in this area, and then we'll work on our next form or our next shape. Okay, so we've got those three joined. Now I'd say that's around a mid-level kind of shape that we've constructed there. So let's go for a junior level kind of shape, which is just our circles, our spheres. So rolling up those spheres, make sure that your spare clay isn't getting too dry. So I like to put a little bit of water or even a wet cloth around the clay, a moist cloth when you're not using it. So we've created our sphere, and then our trusty skewer, poking that in and just rounding it out depending on how big you want that hole to be. And then we have a nice simple shape that looks really nice when you repeat it over and over again. Now when you're making these attachments, you want to make sure that they're not too thick either, because if they're very thick, again, more chance of air bubbles being in the clay, more chances of them exploding in your kiln later on, which will not be fun. So be aware of that any pieces you're attaching don't go too big. Like a lump of clay this big attached to the side of your bowl or pot isn't going to work very well. So working in smaller pieces will be best for this project. So I'm going to make a few more of these, attach them to my pinch pot, and then we'll move on to our next shape. We've got our spherical shapes all done. Now let's attach them to the pot. Have a think about where you want to attach them, whether you're just doing different things in different sections, which I might do. So my other designs here have kind of a mix of all of the shapes hanging around each other. So I might just do sections. So I'm going to join them in the same way that I joined my other shapes, scoring both sides, either slip or a bit of water on both of your pieces, pressing them down, and then using a clay tool just to join the bases together. So I'm going to join all of those, and then we'll move on to our next shape. Okay, so they are attached and they look quite cool together. Having a mass of them together would look really nice. You could fill the whole outside of your pinch pot, or not. You can have little sections, little pieces like this. You might want to draw out your designs and figure that out. But I'm going to go on to my next shape, which I will do my gum nut, which is a little more complicated, might be a little bit more difficult for some students, but have a play with the clay. I recommend having a play first to figure out what you can and can't do. So for my gum nut, I'm just starting always with a sphere and then pinching that out to get the rough shape of the outside, and then we can use some of our tools to work on the inside to hollow that out a little bit. So you kind of just have a play with the tools, figure out what works. So this one has a cool bump on the end, which actually will work really nice. So a lot of playing with clay is a bit of happy accidents and experimenting, seeing what works, and if it doesn't work, just smush up your clay and try again. So I'm moving that clay tool on the inside and just pushing out those edges. What I can do is pinch in the top so that we have a larger base and then smaller as we come out to the inside, hollowing out the clay and ensuring that it is not too thin. So what you might notice is there's sometimes a little cracks in areas that are super thin. So you might notice that it starts to kind of have those lines coming through it. So a little bit of water, keeping that moist, making sure your clay isn't too thin. So some like that might be a little bit too thin compared to the rest of it. You'll start to find trouble where your clay is inconsistent, where you've got really thin areas and really thick areas, especially on joins. So let's avoid that and try and make things roughly the same. Now I wanted a little stem on my pod, so I'll grab a little bit more clay, and I'm actually going to, because it's a small amount of clay, just blend that in. So I'm going to continue making these gum nut shapes and then joining them again to my pinch pot. So I've got my gum nuts attached, got 3 different versions of pods and seeds and shapes, so you can go out and collect some different shapes or organic forms to base your work from. You can look at pictures, whatever you want to draw your inspiration from. So just be aware that when you are attaching your things, you do need to be gentle and lift your pot up to get around those shapes, so you can have a wheel that might help, but one wheel for every student might be a bit much, so just be gentle with your pot as you're picking it up, moving things around. I'm just making sure that when I place that down, that these edges aren't touching the table, because they will come off or snap off if I'm a little bit too rough with them. Also don't want to make these too thin, because they do have a risk of snapping off if they are too thin, even with the natural clay. So I'll just put that down, but there's a whole variety of different shapes you can make and explore. Don't stick to just these ones that I've made here, just showing you some examples of how you can use the tools and how to attach them onto your base. So from here, we need to allow our work to dry, which is why I've completed my pre-made pot, which has been drying. You can tell the difference in the color, so you can see that some of that moisture has come out. So you want to leave your clay pot to dry for preferably a few weeks. It will all depend on climate, and this is where clay gets a little bit tricky, because the different climates, different drying times, depending on how long it's been sitting. You want to make sure that when you pick up your clay piece that it doesn't feel cold. That's a sign that the dampness or the moisture of the clay has gone. The longer you leave it, the better, and the less likely it is to crack it in the kiln. Or you can put your kiln on a really slow drying or a slow temperature to dry out your clay over a long period of time, but I would definitely recommend minimum 2 weeks in a warm climate. Put them next to a heater, that will help them dry out, but otherwise leave it for as long as you can before you put it in the kiln. Now I'm going to go over some of the different types of clay and the different firing times. So I'll get a slide up so it's a little bit easier for you to follow along. So our earthenware clay is a low fire temperature. You would use something like a stoneware clay if you wanted to use your work as a functional piece. So if you wanted to turn this into a mug and drink out of it, that's when you'd use a stoneware. But otherwise, a low fire earthenware or a mid-fire clay is fine for this project. Now we're up to glazing our work. So we can move our tools away. If you've got any spare leftover pieces of clay, you can put them back, wrap them up. Kneading them before, or kneading all the small pieces together before you put it away is a good idea. So I'll just go over quantities for this project. So my actual pot was about a fist size amount of clay, and then I used about 1/3 of a fist for my little small detail pieces on the outside, but I would definitely do more. So let's say for this project, 1.5 fists of clay. It's hard to get the exact measurements for how much clay you need for a project, but that's what I'd go for this, what I'd allow, and then having a little bit extra to make some of those other shapes. So make sure your clay is away, wrapped up. Let's pretend that's wrapped up. And now we can go on to glazing. So we'll work with our pot that has been dried. So when you are firing your pieces, you can do a bisque fire first, or you can paint on your underglaze and then bisque fire. Either way is fine, up to you whether you want to do your glazing first or bisque and then glaze. So when you are working with your glazes for your pot, it's always good to do a test glaze of a tile first, because the way that your glazes look in the container might not necessarily be how they look once they're fired. Now, these have been sitting around a long time, which is definitely what will happen in your art room, I'm going to say. I'm going to use a pop stick to mix them. So if you see the separation like this, don't worry at all, because that's quite normal, especially if your glazes sit around, but just give it a really good stir, a really good mix, and then that will all come back together. If you notice that your glazes are starting to dry out, then you can add a little bit of water to reconstitute those. So make sure that you don't have any separation before you start painting your glaze on. So with the colours, having a test fire and seeing how the colour turns out is definitely good, and will give your students a better idea of what colours they're using on their pot. So my example over here, which I've already painted using just one coat, so you can see some areas are a little bit patchy because that's only one coat of the underglaze applied, and some colours are a bit more opaque than others. So this Alice blue is this Alice blue, so you can see the outside of the container is a little bit green, but you actually get a really nice vibrant blue colour from that. So I am going to just apply this colour. To start with, you can do as many colours as you like, or all the colours, but the application is very similar to how you would apply an acrylic paint. Make sure your brushes are clean, make sure they are dry. Now I will paint, what do I paint? Let's paint my gum nuts. A nice tangerine colour. And when you apply, you'll notice it's quite thick, so a bit thicker than your general acrylic paint. And you want to make sure that you are coating your pieces evenly. And this will dry very quick because this pot has been drying for a long time. So that's really nice about working with these underglazes, is that you can do a second coat pretty much straight away, but it's always good to do one even coat first and then a second coat. So I'm going to go ahead and paint these gum nuts, and we'll come back and paint in our second coat. Okay, so I've painted the glaze over, or the underglaze, over the top of some of my pieces. I'm going to leave my bowl white, but you could paint that as well. I would definitely do a second coat no more than 3, because if you start to do a lot of layers of your underglaze, or if your underglaze is very thick because it might have been drying out a while and all the moisture's come out, what you will notice is that when you fire it, some of that glaze will start to peel off after it has been fired in the kiln, so you don't want to do too many layers. So I think 2 is a good amount. You can also kind of mix your glazes, so you might do 1 layer of the tangerine and then do the yellow. What's this one called? It is called yellow. Or you might do the yellow over the top, or experiment with some of those, or you could do some test fires if you do have the time and resources for your students to have a play with some of those underglaze colours. So the next step, depending on how you're approaching this with your students, let's say we've built our clay pinch pot, we've allowed it to dry for 4 weeks, and then we've put it in the kiln to do that bisque fire. Then we've painted it with our underglaze, we've allowed our underglaze to dry, and now we're up to our clear gloss. So make sure that all of your glazes, all of your clays and all of your glosses are either earthenware, stoneware or a mid-fire. Don't mix them around, otherwise you'll have some trouble when you're firing things in the kiln. So we've got our clear gloss, earthenware, and we need to make sure that everything is mixed really well. So you can see that is some separation in there. So make sure it's mixed really, really well. And then we'll be sure there are no mistakes later on. And that is quite a thick one. So this is a brush-on glaze, depending on what clear gloss you have. You might dip your works. You could even spray them on, but for most schools, I tend to see this brush-on glaze being used. So all we're going to do with the brush on is brush it on. So your clay will dry super fast, so your underglazes are already dry, so you could do a second coat at this stage if you wanted to, and then apply the clear over the top, and you should be able just to go for it. So we want a nice consistent coat. Don't need it to be super thick. This is what will give your clay work that really nice, shiny, glass-like look. So even if you haven't done an underglaze, even if you've left your clay white, or maybe you're using a terracotta, and the terracotta will change the underglaze colours as well, then you can paint directly onto that. But just make sure you do it in a manner where you know where you have painted already, especially working white on white. It might be a bit difficult to see where you have and haven't already painted that glaze on. So I'm going to just coat my entire pot, making sure that I am leaving the underside unglazed, because you might be able to see the difference where the shininess is. If you paint the underside of your pot and put this in the shelf of the kiln, it will stick, and you will be sad and the students will be sad because their work is not coming back off that shelf. So make sure that you are not painting the underside of your pot. But otherwise, I'm going to continue to put this clear glaze over the top. Okay, so I've painted my first layer of the clear gloss. Not that exciting. You'll notice that your work has that white look over it, so all your colours are gone, but don't worry, they'll reappear when they're in the kiln. So for your clear gloss, 2 layers is adequate, 3 or 4, and you'll get a really nice glassy, shiny look when your clay is done on that gloss fire. So that's just 1 layer. You don't need to see the second layer. Same process. Allow that to completely dry and then coat that in the second layer of the brush on gloss. And then your work is good to go in the kiln for that last firing, or whatever temperature clay and glazes you have chosen to use for this work. But otherwise, when your work comes out of the kiln, it will have that really beautiful, shiny look to it. If any of your pieces fall off, then you can either, depending on what you're using your pot for, you can just use super tack or a hot glue gun to adhere it back onto your pot if you're not too worried about it potentially falling off later on down the track if you're handling your piece a lot, or otherwise you can put it back in the kiln with some glue, some kiln glue, and you can refire it and that will attach it a little bit better. But otherwise, that is the end of our nature-inspired pinch pot. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.